Hello everybody, Akinov here, and welcome back to Let's Talk. Today we're going to be talking about combat. Not real life combat, because that's beyond our understanding. We're just a bunch of gamers. And if you're also a gamer and someone who's in the military, well, yeah, whatever. That's fine. That's great and all, but the rest of us, not so knowledgeable. Or unless you're very into some sort of combat sport or something, boxing, some martial art or another, but I'm getting confused by real world stuff. What I would rather talk about is video games, of course, because that's what we talk about here. We talk about video games, and other nerd stuff sometimes, maybe. I mean, I thought about talking about some weird stuff on this channel, but let's just get into combat. What makes good combat? It depends on the game, but it's very easy to say what makes bad combat. But that's less of what we want to talk about. What makes good combat? Let's start with a few things that we know are fairly okay. And since this is mainly an RPG channel, let's start with the basics. The old turn-based combat. When it came to turn-based combat, it was easy to program, it's easy to implement, and it's easy to play, really. It's about not necessarily thrill or anything like that, but it's more so about, okay, I've got a situation, how am I going to approach it? It's very much about taking, being able to see everything that's going on and making decisions. Because in turn-based combat, you can see all of your opponents, as is quite useful. Unless they're like specifically saying, okay, this wave will come in later. But you can see all that's on the field at that moment. And then you respond. You choose your actions, and depending on how this works, you'd either choose your actions for the character who's acting at that point in time, or all your characters, and then the turn plays out. Final Fantasy 1 through 3 did it the latter way, with selecting all the moves of your characters and then playing out. Then if you take Final Fantasy 4 onwards, Final Fantasy being just like, the generic example of turn-based combat, as it is, it was based on the character. There was, ignoring the particular timing, but let's instead go talk about, say, Final Fantasy X, which had it where you had character turns instead of unit turns. So this gives you time to think about what needs to be done and how that can be done and the benefits of doing it. And this actually works rather well. It allows you to make sound decisions, even though you might sometimes fuck up. It lets you make sound decisions, and you can effectively strategize very well using it with one of these systems. It's one of the reasons I like Etrian Odyssey. Other than the fact that it's like incredibly tough to actually start out and late game, but anyway, that's not all too important. Having a turn-based system, it gives you, it's simple and it works. That's the key to it. It's simple and it works, and it lets you think about what you're doing, and generally you just need some good animations for moves, for special moves like your spells or special abilities and such. And it comes across fairly well. And generally when people get into a turn-based RPG, they know what they're getting in for. When it comes to including action, on the other hand, that's when it can get a bit messy. Because you see, action needs to work well. It needs to be responsive and it needs to be quick. So when you have a game where you're like, okay, I'm gonna do this attack now, and it takes like half a second to figure out, oh, that's what they want to do. Yeah, it's not that great. Also, it doesn't work well if your character moves like a tank. You know, old Resident Evil, Silent Hill, I think, had the same sort of control scheme. Yeah, that doesn't really work too well in an action RPG. Just having looked at some older, less refined action RPGs in the past. As far as action RPGs go, I still have to say one of my personal favorites is, and probably will be for a long time, Tales of Phantasia. And that's an old game, but somehow Chris's particular move set, all of his style of combat, it all works really well together. Sure, I may get poisoned and almost killed by ninja when I'm fighting alone, but it allows you to serve the purpose that Chris serves in the team very fluidly. And if you're good with the using an item called the using the command mode, which you get later in the game, you can be even better at it. Which basically acts the same as, you know, a fighting game's inputs. So it's like an RPG with fighting game mechanics. So that actually works well. Although I have to say, other Tales of games I've found to be far less responsive. Because you can, even with Chris's basic melee, you can do a surprisingly large number of things. You can do different run-up techniques. You can do different standing attacks. You can do different air attacks. Well, some of that's crossing over, but you know, that's not really the point. The point is, like, what's satisfying is something that comes together well, that fits with what it is. In an action RPG, a combat system that feels actiony is needed. Even if you're still involving all the RPG elements, which may actually happen quite a lot. Like, if you consider Kingdom Hearts, that's an action RPG. You could call it a straight action game, but you know. And that's really quite heavily focused on large health pools, which, well, at the end of the game you don't have, but the enemies do. You'd go down in basically 1.5 hits, you know, because of the fact that you have whatever technique that saves you from death. Anyway, that's not all too important. What's more important is probably... Now I'm getting confused. Right, we're talking about how combat can be good and how RPGs adopt combat. There's the famous method of Final Fantasy, which is, or at least was through games 4 to 9, to have an active time battle system, which is actually a really awesome system. So it basically put all of your characters on a timer and allowed you to use that character once their timer hit max. So like, you have your 4 party members, or 3 in some games, and it's like, okay, this character's fully charged their gauge, they can act now. And to an extent, they did that in 12 and 13 to an extent. The difference is 13 was boring as hell, and 12, it's not something you notice casually playing that game. You only really get into those sorts of mechanics getting into late game bosses, where it actually matters, and things like timing cures or revives are really important, which is really weird. That's not all too important, talking about that. But yeah, this actually allowed for a lot of interesting firstly, it allowed for a sense of tension in the Final Fantasy games. Like when I was playing Final Fantasy VI, I felt tense. I felt like I had to make a decision quickly, even though I knew that if I went to the spell menu, the time is all paused. I had to make that initial decision quickly. Am I going to attack or am I going to use a spell? And the thing was, with certain characters, I knew I was going to use a spell, or I was going to use an ability, which again I would have time paused for. And regardless of whether it actually increased the pace that you needed to think at, it did give you a sense of tension, and that's not a bad thing in a video game. Like, tension means stakes, and stakes mean that victory is more satisfying. And that's probably what's great about that particular system. Going into a few more systems. I'm trying to think, is there any particular combat system that I can think of that's all too interesting in terms of RPGs? Like, I know the Tales of series has always for a long time stuck to its side view, and for the most part that's all it stuck to for a while, and then eventually it gained a three-dimensional face, which, like in Tales of the Abyss, this actually works really rather well and subtly. I think it also exists in Tales of Symphonia, and probably any game later than those ones. I don't know what order those all came out in, but anyway, those games, they sort of have this where you're normally in a 3D plane, a 2D plane. 3D, you don't. Yes, 3D plane. You're standing on a 3D plane. That is always the case in a lot of games. But anyway, you're in a 2D plane. And on this 2D plane, you can move back and forward. But it also allows you to free move, which changes your 3D plane because you're not 3D plane, 2D plane, because you line up with the enemy you're targeting, which is also a fairly important feature in action RPGs is targeting, because if you don't have the ability to target, well, it's a mess. Now, just talking about targeting and 2D plane. Yeah, having that option to move around makes it really interesting. It allows you to form some advanced strategies. It's especially useful in Tales of Abyss in the arena, where a lot of the enemies you can't dodge back from them, but you can dodge to the side from them. Unless you're a guy, when you can just jump over them and be like, yeehaw! Double jump, double jump, double jump! Which is just plain out ridiculous, but hey, he's super fast. Or if you take the pre-end game method, I've just been like, yeah, I out-heal you. I heal all the damage that you deal to me. Which is what I generally try to do with Cress. But that's beside the point. That's Tales of Phantasia, which has the original 2D thing. Another game that action RPG that's in 2D is the Summon Night Swordcraft story games. They work in a 2D plane, and it is actually fairly effective. And although it's a very different style, because you're playing a single character. You're playing your character and you're fighting monsters or other people, and you work in a 2D plane. You have a fair bit more. It's a fair bit more manual. It's very much, there's abilities and all sorts of stuff, and it's interesting. I personally like it, but that's just opinion. So we've talked a fair bit about this. There's a lot of examples of good combat in video games, and then there's a lot of examples of bad combat. Action RPGs where you may as well not be an action RPG, because all you're doing is pressing the attack button again and again. And you're just getting, and you can't, trying to dodge is actually pointless in a lot of these games that call themselves action RPGs. So, you're in the game, you attack, you don't have a dodge button. You're like, okay, it's going to attack, I'm going to move out of the way. Oh, I'm too slow to move out of the way of anything. So, yeah. Oh, can I block? No, you're not able to block. Oh. Well, this is useful. I mean, useless. This is boring. This is unpleasant to play. It's actually quite sad when you come across games like that. And sadly, like, if I actually think about it, I don't know if Star Ocean First Departure is I know Star Ocean First Departure is a remake. I don't know if it's a remake of the original Star Ocean game, but to be honest, and while I think the first Star Ocean game is fairly old, and I'm talking about a lot of Square Enix properties here. Hey, I might as well mention Dragon Quest. They're stuck to turn-based combat through and through. Good on them. They really know what they're doing. Anyway, yeah, with Star Ocean First Departure on the PSP, its combat is a bit like... How would I describe it? Well, there is actually a way you can learn to dodge in the game, but it's very specific and it's useful only against a few specific enemies. And the dodging is not a mechanic, it's more of you just running away from the enemy before they can strike back. There's not to mention how you move is an auto-lock system where you run up to the enemy and attack them. A bit like Tails, only you don't have these controlled attacks, and you have some special abilities, but you have really limited access to them. Like, you can have two active in a battle, and I don't believe you can change them during battle, if I recall correctly, which... this is probably the reason why I think Tales of Phantasia is a lot better than Star Ocean First Departure, but that's because I played them at similar times. That's just a few types of combat. There's a hell of a lot more if you... And this isn't even getting into what's good first-person shooter combat, what's good other thing combat. This is just me talking about RPG combat. So the thing is, it's gotta make sense. It's gotta... Okay, let's actually look at something that's really, really annoying. And this is probably to me even more annoying about Final Fantasy XIII than how slow and boring the battles are. It's the fact that half the time I can't see all the enemies. I can't tell what's going on. Hell, half the time it takes me a minute to notice that one of my characters is dead. Because I can't see them. I can't see basically anything because, firstly, all the weird-ass camera perspectives. Weird-ass camera perspectives ruin combat in a video game. And then there's all the clutter on the screen. You know, too many animations, too many effects, too many spells going off at once. When there's too much of this crap going on, you can't tell what's going on at all. You can't be like, okay, this is happening. This is what's going on. This is what's happening. I know what I'm gonna do. You can't. And then I'm probably gonna say what I said about why 13 sucks. It could have actually been decent if it was an action RPG, in my opinion. That's just my opinion. And that's especially noticeable in not 13.2, in Lightning Returns, where you control one character and you can block, you can sort of move, but it's like, isn't Lightning supposed to be this quick, athletic, really strong, dangerous character? Yet she walks around, half of her combat, if you want to do well, is precise blocking. She never really seems like the blocking type, which is why this is weird to me. And that's another thing. Combat's got to make sense for your characters. So, this is where I'm going to criticize a game that I do enjoy. Good old Xenosaga Episode 1. There's a weird thing about one of the characters, Momo. Momo is very much an Aoife character. She is very stat geared towards using Aoife. However, you don't have any basic Aoife attacks with Momo. All of her actual, normal attacks are, how should I put it, physical. And it makes no sense. Sure, you're probably mostly going to use her as a healer, sometimes throw out a spell or two. But the thing is, she should be able to use Aoife attacks. It's what makes sense. And they made this the case in Xenosaga Episode 2, where she's strangely swapped from a staff to using a bow, but that's beside the point. Yay for archery, but and it's weird because even though she's this Aoife character, she only has access to one aggressive Aoife spell, if I recall correctly. And if I recall correctly, there's also someone with a set of spells that I never unlocked in that game. I can't remember how that. I never looked up like a entire walkthrough of it or anything, so I wouldn't know. And here's the thing, the Xeno series has had an interesting approach to combat compared to a lot of other games, or at least I think it has. If you look at Xenogears, the combat in that game, the basic attack was different. Ooh, that also brings up a game that I've only played a very little bit of, but had a fairly interesting attack method in terms of an RPG. But I'll talk about that in a second after I talk about Xenogears. Actually, I should probably talk about that first because I don't really know much about it. But it seemed interesting, the little that I did play of it. I believe it was Shadow Hearts. And in that game, when you made an attack, I believe, or any action, you had a wheel or a clock or something appear, and it had basically a clock, what could be called a clock hand that goes around in a circle. And you want to press a button. I think you want to press the X button or something when it's on a one of these certain areas that's colored in. So you got 3 gray areas on the circle and 3 green areas. You want to click on each time it goes onto one of the green areas. So the more times you click, the more damage you do. So precision becomes power. And that's an interesting idea. I haven't really gone to try it much, but yeah, it's a pretty cool idea at the very least. But Xenogears, the combat consisted of, you have a certain amount of action points or something per turn. I think you could build more up by waiting a turn or something. Like your default, which was an interesting thing from Bravely Default, which we'll get into later. And you would be able to choose between light, medium, or heavy moves. Now, heavy moves dealt the most damage, but they consumed the most AP or whatever it was, and you could combo these together. And then, as you used certain combinations more and more in the game, you developed combo moves. These combo moves were activated by, say, pressing XOO square, XOO triangle or something. I don't think pressing XOO triangle would be, because I think triangle's heavy, so that would be 1, 5, 8 AP. I don't think I ever reached the point where I had 8 AP. I don't think you could. But I may be wrong. I don't have the best memory of when I played this. It was a while ago. And that's really quite cool about the game. Xenosaga took on a slightly different approach to this. It's a very similar system again. And remember, alongside this, you have all of your like spells and special attacks and stuff still. But Xenosaga took a slightly different approach to this. It's very similar, but slightly different. You had basically each character had basically two starting attacks. They had They had like move at what was it? It's let me see, what do I think it was? I think it was a triangle and box, or I think it's triangle and I think it's box. Anyway, and you press these two buttons. You press one of these buttons to do. All right. You actually technically might have three options. Okay. So I remember now how it works. You have your triangle and your box move, which are your basics. And these consume, or at least in the first one, you had a maximum of 6 AP. Okay, and every turn you got 4. So you could use 4 of that in a turn. Or you could use 2, wait another turn, and you have 6. With 6, that would allow you to use an O move that you might have by default available, which would probably not be as powerful as something else, but or you could use 2 basic moves, which it would actually create a variance. Like if you went triangle, triangle, that would be the second triangle would be different from if you went box, triangle, etc., etc. You know, you get the basic idea. And if you doing those 2 moves, but at the end you'd have the option to do an O move, which would be a special move, a more powerful move. And later in the game you can unlock fast moves, which are quite expensive to unlock, but so you could just be like, oh, I've got 4, okay, I'm going to use triangle O, and you can get off one of your powerful O moves really quickly. This is really useful late game in that, because you can do powerful moves and you can I'm trying to think of how to term it correctly. You can use powerful moves and you can basically there's a bonus to using these special moves. You got more boost gauge, which is an interesting mechanic in an RPG. It allowed you to put yourself into the turn. It allowed you to skip turns, which was really handy and a really cool mechanic. And it made the combat It made the combat fun and made planning your moves really interesting. And now I don't really know too much about Xenosaga Episode 3. I haven't played it, so I don't know what they changed up there or what they may or may not have fixed. But Xenosaga 2, Episode 2 is very similar to Xenosaga Episode 1, minus some very noticeable changes. Like, it's different, but it's similar enough that you won't go too insane looking at it. Oh yeah. Now let's talk about perhaps my favorite combat system in any RPG, Xenoblade Chronicles. I am a sucker for this game series. Although I told myself the other day, you should stop wanting to play Xenoblade Chronicles Cross. Just go back and play Xenoblade Chronicles, it's better. Which, in a lot of ways it is, and in some ways it's not. It's not as pretty. It's nowhere near as pretty. I mean, it's pretty, but imagine if they Never mind me wanting Xenoblade Chronicles in HD. Just, Xenoblade Chronicles, not Xenoblade Chronicles Cross. I want Xenoblade Chronicles in HD, but that's my selfish desire for HD. It wasn't an action RPG, but it wasn't turn-based. It was... Well, what it was about was how it worked was you had your auto attacks and you had your abilities. We'll stick to that. That's the basics. And your auto attacks went off when you were near enough to an enemy to attack it that you were targeting to attack and you had engaged in combat. If you're not in combat, you're not going to attack that. So at least you're not attacking randomly. At least you haven't set the gambit on your party members to attack anything they see. Which is useful in Final Fantasy XII sometimes, but not all the time. Ignoring Final Fantasy XII, which, while I also enjoy a lot, isn't the topic that I want to talk about at this very second. Because I've just been talking about a lot of different combat systems, and then you have your abilities, which are really quite cool because their effect is a lot of their effect is based on a lot of them are effective based on where you're attacking the enemy from, or they have an area of effect. Like this one hits all the enemies in front of you for a certain distance. So I'm only trying to aggro this one enemy. I don't want to use this ability because it'll drag a bunch of enemies that I don't want to fight. So I'm not going to use, say, my sweeping move. Then one of my party members, because you can't program them, decides, hey, or I think I know when this is most common. When one of my party members is using Ricky, and I'm not controlling him. Flamey, or I forget what it's actually called. Oh, well, he'll poison everything in front of us, and well, that gets them pissed, and I'm like, oh man. But yeah, and there's a fair bit of a learning curve to that game. They have mechanics that are designed to allow you to deal massive damage. This is actually true for both Xenoblade Chronicles and Xenoblade Chronicles Cross, even though Xenoblade Chronicles is probably easier to pull off the massive damage and probably kill super bosses with compared to Xenoblade Chronicles, although killing things is easy in that game. Wait, no, I got that backwards. I think Xenoblade Chronicles Cross is harder to make it work quite so well, although I do have a planned design character build that I have in mind that's going to be like destroy everything, leave nothing behind. Ultimate power will be mine. Yeah, it may just be me going a bit crazy, but it's all in all a really cool system. Actually, I don't know what I'm going to put in the video for this. Crap, because like I talked about a lot of games and I don't have footage for all of them. Actually, I don't have footage for most of them because it's kind of a pain to get your hand like. I can do it. I can do a fair few of them, yeah. I can get Star Ocean footage, I can get Tales of Phantasia footage, I can just rip that from one of my episodes. Now I'm just talking about what footage I can get. I shouldn't even mention that here. You know what I do, I talk about stuff. Anyway, this has just been a few of my thoughts on combat and RPGs. So I hope you enjoyed listening to me ramble about stuff. It's what I do.